The fuel pump hummed its usual melody as Jake Miller wiped down the counter for the third time that night. It was one of those habits you pick up when you're alone too much, cleaning things that are already clean just to have something to do with your hands. Out here on the edge of human territory, business was slow. Real slow. Maybe 3 ships a week if he was lucky, and that was pushing it. The outer terminus routes didn't attract much traffic anymore, not since the core worlds opened up those fancy new jump lanes closer to civilization. Jake's station had become a relic, a forgotten pit stop on roads nobody traveled. Some nights he wondered why he stayed. Then he'd remember the mortgage on this place and the fact that he was too stubborn to admit defeat. Tonight was shaping up to be another quiet one. He'd already checked the fuel levels twice, run diagnostics on equipment that didn't need diagnosing, and even organized his spare parts by size. Exciting stuff. The proximity alarm shattered the quiet like a hammer through glass. Jake's coffee mug hit the counter as his eyes shot to the scanner display. The screen lit up with red warnings, numbers scrolling too fast to read properly. Something big was coming in, and it was coming in hot. The trajectory made his stomach clench. It was all wrong. The ship was wobbling through space, overcorrecting like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. Whoever was flying that thing was either dying or already dead. He rushed to the observation window, his boots hammering against the metal floor. Through the scratched plexiglass, he watched the vessel drop out of jump space way too close to the station. For a second he thought it might miss the landing pad entirely and plow straight into his fuel tanks. That would be one hell of a way to go. The ship crashed onto the pad with a screech of tortured metal that made Jake's teeth hurt. The landing struts buckled on impact, and sparks flew like angry fireflies in the dark. The whole station shook. His coffee mug, forgotten on the counter, finally gave up and toppled over. Jake stood frozen at the window, staring at the wreckage. The ship was like nothing he'd ever seen in his 6 years running this station, and he'd seen some weird stuff. The hull wasn't smooth metal like human ships or even the angular designs the Centauri preferred. This thing had scales. Actual scales, layered like a snake's skin, shimmering even in the dim station lights. It looked less like a machine and more like a living creature that had been turned inside out. Smoke poured from at least a dozen breaches in the hull. Scorch marks ran along the sides, deep, black burns that told a story Jake knew too well from his military days. Plasma weapons. Heavy ones. This ship had been in a fight and from the looks of it, barely escaped with its life. The airlock hissed open with a sound like a dying breath. Jake's own breath caught in his throat. A dragon stepped out. Or stumbled out, really. There was nothing graceful about it. Not a metaphor. Not some fancy ship design that looked dragon-like. An actual, honest-to-God dragon. 12 feet of reptilian muscle and scales, though right now she looked more like a wounded animal than the apex predator she should have been. Her scales, which probably gleamed like polished bronze when she was healthy, were dulled by exhaustion and crusted with dark blood. Massive wings dragged behind her, scraping against the landing pad because she was too weak to fold them properly. Draconians. Jake had only seen them in vids during his military briefings. The ancient ones. The proud ones. The species that had been flying through space when humans were still figuring out fire. They considered humans barely worth acknowledging, like ants at a picnic. Annoying but irrelevant. This one looked anything but proud right now. She made it maybe 20 feet from her ship before her legs gave out. She collapsed hard, her massive body hitting the pad with a thud Jake felt through the floor. One clawed hand reached forward, scraping against the metal, reaching toward the fuel pumps like they were salvation itself. Please. Her voice was a rasp, grinding and wrong. She was forcing words through a throat that wasn't built for human speech, and every syllable sounded like it hurt. I cannot but I beg, the younglings, my cargo? Jake was already moving. His military training kicked in before his brain could catch up, overriding the shock and the 1,000 questions flooding his mind. He grabbed the emergency med kit from the wall, the big one, not the patch-and-go box, and ran. Up close, she was even more massive than she'd looked from the window. Her head alone was the size of his torso. Each breath came shallow and labored, her chest barely moving. Burns covered her sides, fresh and angry. Weapon fire and recent. Maybe hours old. The edges were sealed shut with what looked like self-cauterization. She'd done field medicine on herself while flying. Tuff didn't even begin to cover it. Ma'am, stay still. I've got you. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Her golden eyes found his, and Jake forgot how to breathe for a second. They were huge, reptilian, alien. But the expression in them was universal. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of soldiers who knew they were dying, in refugees fleeing colonies under attack. Desperation. Pure raw desperation. The eggs? She whispered, and then her eyes rolled back. Consciousness left her like air from a punctured hull. Jake stared at the unconscious alien sprawled across his landing pad. Then at her dying ship, still smoking and sparking. Then at the fuel pumps that definitely weren't designed for whatever exotic fuel kept Draconian vessels running. He looked up at the stars, at the vast empty nothing surrounding his little station, and let out a long breath. Well, he muttered, grabbing her arm and starting the impossible task of dragging 12 feet of unconscious dragon toward his station entrance. There goes my quiet night. Jake managed to get the Draconian onto the medical platform in his back room, though calling it managed was being generous. It was more like 40 minutes of dragging, cursing, and seriously questioning his life choices. She'd been muttering something while semi-conscious, a name that sounded like Thera. At least, that's what his translator caught between the growls and hisses. The medical platform wasn't designed for 12-foot aliens. Hell, it barely handled humans over 6 feet without complaining. But Jake had learned a long time ago that not designed for just meant requires creative problem solving. He propped her up with cargo netting and storage crates, making sure her wings weren't bent at weird angles. It looked ridiculous, but it worked. Always made it work. The bioscanner was having an absolute meltdown trying to make sense of her. The screen flickered between readings, error messages popping up faster than Jake could dismiss them. Reptilian baseline, sure, but the energy signatures were completely foreign. The machine kept trying to tell him she was both alive and dead at the same time, which was unhelpful at best. What he could figure out wasn't good. Her energy readings should have been off the charts. Draconians were known for running hot, their metabolism burning like a fusion reactor. But hers? Rock bottom. She wasn't just tired or injured. She was depleted. Completely empty. Like a battery that had been drained past zero and was now eating itself to keep going. Jake did what he could with human medical supplies. He cleaned the wounds that weren't already sealed shut, applied some basic stabilizers, and hooked her up to N4 even though he had no idea if Draconians could process human fluids. The wounds themselves were brutal but professionally handled. She'd cauterized them herself, probably while flying. Jake had done field medicine in the colony wars and he recognized the signs. She'd burned her own flesh shut to keep from bleeding out, all while piloting a dying ship through hostile space. That took guts. Or scales. Whatever. What she really needed was rest and energy, but he couldn't provide either in the right format. Human food wouldn't work for her biology, and he definitely didn't have whatever exotic fuel Draconian bodies ran on. But she'd said something before passing out. Something that wouldn't stop echoing in his head. Cargo. Younglings. Jake stared at her unconscious form for a long moment, then made a decision that was probably stupid. He grabbed his override key from the equipment locker and headed for her ship. 20 minutes later he stood at her airlock, key in hand, hesitating. This was illegal on about 40 different levels. Boarding an alien vessel without permission violated at least 3 interstellar treaties. If anyone found out, he could lose his station license, maybe face criminal charges. The Draconians themselves would probably consider it a death penalty offense. But those eyes, that desperation, it haunted him. Jake used the override key. The airlock opened with a hiss that sounded almost relieved, like the ship itself was grateful someone had come. Jake stepped inside and immediately felt like he'd walked into a dream. Or maybe a museum showcasing technology humans wouldn't invent for another 1,000 years. Even damaged and dying, the ship was beautiful. The walls weren't metal or any material Jake recognized. They looked organic, almost alive, with a faint texture like skin. They pulsed with light, soft, dying light, but light nonetheless. The illumination moved through the walls like blood through veins, getting dimmer as he walked deeper inside. The controls didn't have buttons or switches. They looked more like art installations, smooth surfaces that probably responded to touch or thought, or maybe just pure intention. Jake had no idea how to fly this thing, but he knew enough to recognize genius when he saw it. He found the cargo bay near the back of the ship. The doors opened smoothly despite the damage everywhere else, and Jake's heart stopped dead in his chest. 30 of them arranged in neat rows. Each one was massive, easily the size of a human torso, resting in pods made of something that looked like crystal but felt warm to the touch. The pods glowed from within, soft light wrapping around each egg like a protective blanket. Stasis chambers, Jake realized. Keeping the eggs alive, keeping them safe. But the glow was fading. Alarms blinked all around the bay in colors Jake didn't understand, alien warnings in an alien language. But he didn't need to read Draconian to understand what was happening. The lights were dimming. The temperature was dropping. The pods were failing. The eggs were dying. Kids, Jake whispered to the empty cargo bay. She's carrying kids. His hands shook as he moved between the rows, checking each pod. All of them failing. All of them showing the same declining life signs. How long did they have? Hours? Days? He had no way to know. Jake found the ship's log system near the cargo bay entrance and managed to pull up recent entries. The translation matrix was damaged, glitching out every few words, but he caught enough to piece together the story. An attack. Sudden and overwhelming. Raiders, Kryneth, the species that had been terrorizing the outer sectors for years, slavers and murderers. A colony burning. Not just burning, being destroyed systematically. Thousands dead. And Thera, running through the chaos, grabbing what she could. Not treasure. Not weapons. Not technology. Eggs. She grabbed every egg she could carry and ran. Just ran. The logs showed 3 weeks of flight. 3 weeks of constant running, systems failing one by one, fuel running lower and lower. 3 weeks of desperation and fear, watching the stasis pods drain while she searched for help that never came. Because Draconians didn't ask for help. Ever. Their pride wouldn't allow it. They'd rather die alone than admit they needed anyone. Until tonight. Until she'd had no choice left. Jake looked at the dying eggs, at the fading lights, at the story written in desperate flight logs. He looked at his own hands, scarred from years of fixing broken things with whatever was available. And he made a decision that would change everything. This is insane, Jake muttered to himself for the 100th time, staring at the incompatible fuel ports like they'd personally offended him. Completely insane. He'd been at it for an hour now, and the problem hadn't gotten any simpler. The station's fuel system was quantum matrix-based, standard issue for human ships. Every vessel that docked here for the past 6 years used the same basic setup. Simple, reliable, boring. Draconian technology ran on something else entirely. A crystalline energy matrix with a name Jake couldn't even pronounce, let alone replicate. The readouts he'd pulled from Thera's ship looked more like abstract art than engineering diagrams. Trying to connect human fuel to Draconian stasis pods was like trying to power a computer with a potato. Technically both involved energy, but that's where the similarities ended. Jake sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead and leaving a streak of grease in its place. The cargo bay felt smaller with every passing minute, the walls closing in. 30 eggs, all of them depending on him figuring this out. No pressure. But Jake had spent 6 years in colony defense before buying the station, and those 6 years had taught him one critical skill: making broken things work with whatever garbage you had lying around. Keeping ancient equipment running with spare parts, duct tape and prayer. If there was one thing humans were genuinely good at, it was improvising when everything was going wrong. He stood up and started pulling equipment from storage. Every converter he'd collected over the years, some dating back to his military days. Adapters that didn't officially exist because they bridged systems that were never meant to talk to each other. Jury-rigged pieces he'd built himself during long, boring nights when there was nothing else to do. His hands moved on autopilot, connecting pieces that had no business being in the same room together, let alone the same circuit. The eggs had maybe 12 hours before the stasis fields failed completely. After that, the temperature would drop, the protective barriers would collapse, and those kids would just stop. He didn't want to think about after that. 4 hours crawled by. Jake's back screamed at him from being hunched over. His hands were black with grease, and he'd burned himself twice on exposed circuits. The converter was taking shape, though calling it ugly would be generous. It looked like something a child might build if you gave them a box of random parts and no instructions. But the readings were promising. Almost there. Just needed to bridge the frequency gap between. What are you doing? Jake nearly jumped out of his skin. He spun around, reaching for a wrench like it might help. Thera stood in the doorway of her ship's cargo bay, one massive hand gripping the frame for support. She looked steadier than before, but not by much. Her scales had regained some of their color, though she still moved like every step hurt. Trying to save your kids, Jake said, forcing his heart rate back to normal. He turned back to his work, connecting another wire. Sit down before you fall down. You. Thera moved closer, her voice thick with something between confusion and disbelief. You're trying to adapt human fuel cells to Draconian stasis pods. That's the idea, yeah. That's impossible. She said it flat, like stating a fact. The energy matrices are completely incompatible. Our engineers spent decades trying to create universal power converters. They all failed. Yeah, well, nobody told the equipment that. Jake connected another wire, checking the readout. I've got the harmonics almost matched. Just need to bridge the frequency gap and we should be good. Thera moved closer, her massive form casting a shadow over his work. Jake felt her presence like a weight, this ancient being watching him fumble with technology her people had probably perfected before humans discovered electricity. She studied the mess of wires and components he'd cobbled together, and her golden eyes went wide. This is... She paused, searching for words. Crude. Incredibly crude. But the underlying principle might actually work. Jake couldn't help but grin. Crude's kind of our specialty. We're not fancy but we get the job done. He glanced up at her. Seriously though, you should be resting. You nearly died a few hours ago. They're my responsibility. Thera lowered herself carefully next to him, wincing as her injured body protested. Her clawed hands, steadier now than before, reached for one of the loose components. If there's a chance to save them, I must try. Even if that means accepting help from a... She paused again, the words clearly difficult. From a human. Jake caught the pause, heard everything she didn't say. You can say it straight. Your people think we're primitive. I've heard the stories. Seen the way draconian ships won't even respond to our hails. Yes. She didn't apologize or try to soften it. We have watched humans for 3 centuries. Always fighting among yourselves, always struggling with basic problems, never achieving the technological heights of older species. We thought you lacked potential. That you would destroy yourselves before reaching the stars properly. And now? Jake asked, fitting another piece into place. Thera's golden eyes fixed on the makeshift converter he'd built from literal garbage and sheer stubbornness. Now I'm watching a human do something my own engineers, trained for decades with resources beyond imagination, said was impossible. And you're doing it with equipment we would consider garbage. In 4 hours. Jake couldn't help but smile despite the exhaustion pulling at him. Well, stick around. You haven't seen anything yet. He pointed to a blue component wrapped in loose wires. Hand me that plasma regulator, the blue thing with all the wires hanging off it. They worked side by side for the next 6 hours. It was awkward at first. Thera explained the principles of draconian energy flow in terms that made Jake's head hurt, concepts that didn't translate well into human physics. Jake showed her the shortcuts he'd learned, the workarounds that made no sense on paper but somehow worked in practice. She was amazed by his willingness to just try things. To connect something, watch it fail, disconnect it, and immediately try a different approach. No hesitation, no lengthy calculations. Just constant adaptation. Your kind doesn't give up, she said softly as the first pod's lights began to stabilize, glowing brighter and steadier. Can't afford to, Jake replied, already moving to the next pod with his jury-rigged converter. Not when lives are on the line. Giving up is easy. Keeping going is what matters. By dawn, all 30 pods glowed with steady light. The temperature readings were stable. The life signs were strong. The eggs were safe. Alive. Thera's shoulders shook, her massive frame trembling. Jake realized with shock that she was crying. He'd never seen a dragon cry before. Didn't even know they could. Tears tracked down her scaled face, catching the light from the stabilized pods. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. My people would have let them die rather than ask for help. Their pride would have doomed these younglings. But you didn't hesitate. Didn't even question. Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the raw gratitude in her voice. They're kids. That's all that matters. They sat in Jake's small kitchen, an odd pair if there ever was one. A human and a dragon, sharing recycled coffee at 6 a.m. while the station's life support hummed in the background. The kitchen wasn't designed for guests, especially not 12-foot reptilian ones. Thera had to crouch awkwardly, her wings folded tight against her back, her head nearly brushing the ceiling. She'd insisted on hearing about humanity. Not the propaganda or the historical files Draconians kept, but the real story. Jake found himself talking about things he rarely discussed, even with other humans. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the strange intimacy of saving someone's life. Either way, the words came easier than they should have. We nearly destroyed ourselves, he admitted, staring into his coffee like it held answers. 5 different world wars before we got our heads on straight. And those are just the big ones. Doesn't count all the smaller conflicts, the civil wars, the genocides. We were really good at killing each other. Thera's golden eyes watched him carefully. What changed? We learned that survival trumps pride. That asking for help isn't weakness, it's common sense. Jake refilled his mug with the recycled coffee that tasted more like motor oil than anything natural. Took us losing about 4 billion people to figure that out, but we got there eventually. Someone finally stood up and said, "Hey, maybe we should stop being idiots." And enough people listened. He took a sip, grimaced at the taste, and continued. "We were proud, territorial, stupid. Everyone thought their way was the only right way." Sound familiar? Thera's expression was unreadable, that reptilian face showing emotions Jake was still learning to recognize. When she spoke, her voice went heavy with something dark. "My people haven't learned that lesson." "Yeah," Jake prompted gently. "The Kryneth raiders attacked my colony 3 weeks ago." The words came slowly, like each one hurt to say. "Overwhelming force. 3 capital ships and dozens of fighters. We had maybe an hour's warning before they hit us." Jake stayed quiet, letting her talk. "We could have called the coalition. They have rapid response fleets specifically for situations like this. We could have requested aid from any of a dozen species within range. The Centauri would have come. Even the Vex, despite their usual neutrality." Thera's claws scraped against the metal table, leaving shallow gouges. "But the Council refused. Draconians don't beg. We don't ask for help. We've stood alone for 10,000 years, and we would continue to stand alone. So they died instead," Jake said quietly. "Yes." The word was barely a whisper, full of pain. "Thousands of them. Warriors who fought until their last breath. Elders who tried to shield the young with their own bodies. Children who never had a chance to grow up. And the Council still refused to call for help, even as our cities burned, even as the screams filled the air. They said it would dishonor our ancestors. That we would rather die with dignity than live with shame." Jake thought about the 30 eggs in the cargo bay, those lives hanging in the balance. "But you ran." "I broke our most sacred law." Thera's voice cracked. "I took the eggs from the colony vault and fled. Every single egg I could carry I grabbed and ran for my ship. In the eyes of my people I'm kinslayer now. A traitor. I abandoned the fight to save the young." She paused, her whole body trembling. "The warriors who died buying me time, holding off the raiders while I reached my ship. They thought I was going for reinforcements. They died believing help was coming, that I would return with allied forces. I let them believe that lie. I let them die with false hope because if they'd known the truth, they would have stopped me." "You saved 30 lives," Jake said firmly. "I damned my soul." Thera met his eyes and Jake saw the raw guilt there. "And I would do it again. Every single time. Their pride, their honor, their precious traditions, none of it is worth a single youngling's life. Not one." Jake was quiet for a moment, letting that hang in the air. Then he stood and walked to his terminal, something nagging at the back of his mind. "Speaking of which, we might have a problem." He pulled up the sensor data he'd collected while working on her ship, running a deep scan he'd been too busy to check earlier. The results made his blood run cold. "Your ship's got a tracking beacon," he said, his voice tight. "The Kryneth planted it, probably during the initial attack. Active transmission. They've been following you this whole time." Thera's blood went cold. Jake watched the color drain from her scales. "How long do we have?" 48 hours, maybe less if they're pushing their engines hard." Jake pulled up star charts, his mind already racing through options. "Your ship's repaired enough to fly now, and the eggs are stable. But you won't make it to Draconian space before they catch you. Not even close. You need an escort. Protection. I have no allies to call." Thera's voice was hollow. "The coalition would take weeks to respond through proper channels. My own people." She laughed, a bitter sound that had no humor in it. "They'd sooner see me captured and the eggs destroyed than break their precious isolation. I'm alone." Jake stared at the star charts for a long moment. Calculation after calculation ran through his head. Then he did something that was probably crazy, definitely reckless, and absolutely human. He activated the Outer Terminus Emergency Network and started making calls. "What are you doing?" Thera demanded, standing so fast she nearly hit her head on the ceiling. "Calling in favors." Jake's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up contact after contact. He hit the first number. "Hey Tom? Jake Miller at Station 47. Yeah, long time. Listen, I need a favor, big one. Got a refugee situation here. Slavers on her tail and she's carrying kids. 30 of them. How fast can you get here?" He didn't wait for the full response before moving to the next call. "Hey Rick? Yes, Jake. Remember that time I gave you fuel on credit when your accounts were frozen? Time to return the favor." One call after another. His voice steady, urgent but not panicked. He called freighter captains he'd helped during emergencies. Colony militia commanders who owed him drinks. A science vessel captain named Beth who'd once needed fuel and repairs when she had no way to pay. Jake, you're calling in every favor you've ever earned, Thera said, watching in complete disbelief. Years of goodwill all at once. Yep. He finished another call and moved to the next. That's what they're for. But why? She couldn't understand it. What do you gain from this? These are your resources, your relationships. You're spending everything for someone you met hours ago. Jake stopped typing and looked at her like she just asked why water was wet. You're a mother running from slavers with 30 kids. That's all I need to know. Thera stared at this human, this primitive, impossible, incredible human, and felt something crack inside her chest. The walls she'd built over centuries. The pride she'd carried like armor. The absolute certainty of her people's superiority. All of it crumbling in the face of simple, uncomplicated kindness. They came. Jake stood at the observation window 40 hours after making those calls, watching space itself tear open as ships dropped out of jump. His coffee had gone cold in his hand hours ago, but he couldn't look away from the sight. Not 1 or 2 ships. Not 5. Not even 10. 47 human vessels materialized around Miller's station like a protective swarm. They came from every direction, arriving in waves, each one announcing their presence with a flash of displaced energy. Freighters that should have been hauling cargo across the core worlds. Their holds had been hastily converted into fighter bays, launch tubes welded onto hulls never meant for combat. Colony defense boats bristling with mismatched weapons. Some human, some alien tech they traded for or salvaged. A medical transport with red crosses painted on white hulls. A mining vessel that had improvised shields from its or processing equipment. There was even a luxury yacht, sleek and expensive looking, that had absolutely no business anywhere near a fight. But they came anyway. The comm system erupted with voices, dozens of captains checking in all at once. Jake had to sort through the chaos to hear individual messages. This is Captain Ryan of the freighter Second Chance. The voice was gruff, worn down by years of space travel. Heard you've got a situation, Miller? We're here to help. Just point us where you need us. Captain Beth on the Discovery. A woman's voice, younger and energetic. Where do you need us, Jake? We've got medical supplies and spare parts if anyone needs them. Tom here with the mining crew. Ready when you are, buddy. We brought the big drills. One by one they checked in. Ship after ship. Humans Jake had helped over the years, some he barely remembered. Captains who'd stopped at his station once for fuel. Militia members from colonies he'd never even visited. People who knew Jake. None of them had ever met Thera. None of them had any stake in draconian politics or their ancient conflicts. They gained absolutely nothing from being here except danger and wasted fuel. They came because Jake asked. Because somewhere out there, kids were in danger. Because that's what humans did when someone needed help. Thera stood beside Jake at the window, staring at the assembled fleet with an expression he couldn't read. Her mouth opened and closed several times but no sound came out. Her voice had simply stopped working. Jake activated the main comm channel, broadcasting to all ships. All ships, this is Miller's station. Thanks for coming. Here's the situation. We've got a draconian vessel carrying 30 eggs, unhatched kids. They're refugees from a Kryneth attack 3 weeks ago. The raiders planted a tracking beacon and they're maybe 20 hours out. She needs escort to safe space and she needs it now. There was a pause. Then someone asked, voice uncertain, Draconian? Like the actual Draconians? The ones who think we're beneath them? The ones who won't even answer our hails? The ones who are in trouble, Jake said firmly, his voice carrying steel. And who asked for help? That's all that matters. We don't pick and choose who deserves saving based on how they treated us before. The silence stretched out. Jake held his breath, wondering if he'd pushed too far, asked too much. Then Captain Ryan's voice came back, steady and resolved. Understood. All ships were forming a defensive convoy. Draconian vessel at center. Combat ships on perimeter. Freighters as second line. Medical and support vessels in reserve. Anyone got a problem with that? No one did. Not a single voice objected. The fleet organized itself with surprising efficiency. Fighter escorts took positions around Thera's ship. Sensor ships spread out to watch for incoming threats. Even the luxury yacht positioned itself to provide additional shield coverage, its owner apparently deciding that expensive shields were worth using to protect kids. Why? Thera finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. Why are they doing this? They owe me nothing. My people have shown them nothing but contempt for centuries. Jake smiled, tired but genuine. Because we're human. This is what we do. We're not the strongest species out there, not even close. We're not the smartest or the most advanced. Hell, half our technology is held together with improvised parts and hope. But we're maybe the best at one thing in this entire galaxy: showing up when someone needs help. Even when it's hard. Even when it's dangerous. Even when the person we're helping wouldn't have done the same for us. The journey to Draconian Refuge Space took 3 days of careful travel. They moved as one unit, the convoy adjusting and adapting like a living thing. Captains who'd never worked together before coordinated like they'd been doing it for years. The Kryneth came on day 2. 6 Raider ships dropped out of jump space ahead of the convoy, weapons already charging. They looked confident, aggressive, ready for an easy fight against one damaged Draconian vessel. They weren't expecting 47 humans who'd decided someone needed protecting. The fight was short and brutal. The humans fought like they built things, adaptable, creative, and absolutely refusing to quit or back down. When the Raiders tried to flank the convoy, freighters broke formation and rammed them, sacrificing their cargo holds to protect Thera's ship. When the Raiders tried to run, miners used their drilling lasers as improvised weapons, cutting through armor plating like it was paper. The luxury yacht, of all things, landed the killing blow on the Kryneth command ship. Someone had jury-rigged a torpedo from fuel cells and spare parts, turning a pleasure craft into a weapon. The explosion lit up space like a second sun. The Kryneth retreated, limping away on damaged engines. They'd lost 4 ships and gained a healthy respect for human stubbornness and creativity. At the refuge station, Thera's people waited. Other survivors from destroyed colonies. Scattered eggs that had been saved by others like Thera who'd chosen life over pride. Dragons who'd broken their own laws to protect the future. Jake helped unload the stasis pods, watching the Draconians gather around the eggs with reverence and tears streaming down their scaled faces. Thera stood among them, surrounded by her people, no longer alone in her choice. "I must tell them," she said to Jake quietly. "Tell them what I've learned. What you taught me." She activated the long-range transmitter, sending a message directly to the Draconian Council on their home world. For the first time in millennia, a Draconian openly advocated for alliance with younger species. "I have learned that true strength requires humility," her message said, her voice clear and strong. "The humans showed me this truth. They saved my life, saved my younglings, and asked nothing in return. While we burned in our pride and isolation, they extended their hands without hesitation. The measure of civilization is not found in weapons or technology or ancient heritage, but in compassion and the willingness to help those in need." Weeks later, Jake received news that changed everything. The Draconian Council had made official contact with the Human Colonial Alliance. The first formal alliance in their 10,000-year history with a species they'd considered primitive. The Kryneth slavers, suddenly caught between dragon fire and human determination, found the outer sectors very unhealthy for their business. Their raid stopped. Their ships fled to darker corners of space. Jake received a personal message at his quiet station one morning. The eggs had hatched. All 30 of them healthy and strong. Thera had named one of the younglings Jakora, which meant the bridge in Draconian. He sat at his counter looking out at the stars like he did every night and smiled. The galaxy was learning what humans had always known. That civilization's true measure wasn't found in superior weapons or advanced technology or ancient pride. It was found in the simple act of helping a stranger in need. And sometimes that simple act changed everything.